right, so we are in, like I said, John chapter 2. I don't know if I said that correctly. John chapter 2, lesson 4. And, we had just, sorry, I'm trying to get, I'm in First John, my Bible. So, Jeremiah had obviously discussed the first chapter of John, kind of an introduction of, the testimony of John the Baptist, Jesus recruiting his first disciples, the calling of Philip and Nathanael. And so it goes here in chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. The mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, and when they had ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.'" So, we know this story. This is a story that if you have been in the church for any length of time, or really at all, the story of Jesus turning water into wine is one of the stories that is often misrepresented, but known by the world. They may not know the context. They may not know all the details, but you hear often, well, Jesus turned water into wine. And that's usually where it goes, and you have to kind of go from there as far as the explanation. The first question, and I didn't know that this was, I don't know why this is, I guess, discussed as much as it is, but the first question says, "From what is the third day measured?" And the only reason I asked that is I had read another book that was talking about how the third day, it's not clear where this third day is counted from. And I guess that may be true because it doesn't say the first day. But based on chapter 1, where do you think, why is this the third day from what?
When you left Jordan.
Okay.
It takes 2 days, quite what said in here.
Yeah. The book says that it's based on when he left Jordan. It took him 2 days to get to Capernaum, or Cana, sorry, Capernaum was later, Cana, and that would have been the third day. I think there were 4 days listed in chapter 1, so it was kind of like the end of the week, if I remember correctly. But yeah, so the journey from Jordan to Cana. I don't know. I was trying to figure out, some of the details that the book brings out on this wedding, I couldn't find. I don't know if there was a little bit of, assumption or speculation. I think that obviously you're going to have some of that, and I don't think that's wrong, but, maybe stating it as a fact. It says that it was, sorry, I'm finding it. In a sec, right under the picture of the water pots, if you've got the book, it says, "Jesus' mother was at a wedding feast in Cana, and she presumably was the one who invited Jesus and his disciples." I don't know if that's necessarily the case. The passage says, the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. Yes, that may be she was there and she invited them. Whether or not they were invited to the party, I don't know. It doesn't necessarily matter. What is the most significant thing in this story?
Jesus is there. Jesus said it's good.
Okay. Yeah. Do what?
I was going to say his first miracle.
Yeah. The idea, and I don't know, if this wedding party, I've wondered this, and this is like one of those, you sit back and wonder. I wonder if this wedding party truly knew who they had at their wedding. When you hear about somebody that became great or did great things, but you knew them way back when they were in high school or whatever, and you're like, man, I used to know them when, before everybody knew them. Everybody likes to be the one that knew them before it was cool. Like, oh, I used to listen to that band before they got big, and if you did that, you often tell people all the time, I like them way before you did. It's kind of one of those badge of honor things. But the fact that Jesus and his disciples were here, it was a big deal. Now, They run out of wine, and Mary says to, side note, and I think it's brought out, that Mary is never mentioned, the name Mary is never mentioned in the book of John. I don't think I realized that till I read it, but it's always talking about Jesus' mother. But anyway, she says to Jesus, they're out of wine. Why do you think that she tells Jesus this?
She knew he could do something about it.
But why? How? Had he done anything before?
We're not told that he's done anything before that we know of.
Well, I mean, it says in that it was the first one. It says this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. So as far as we know, this is the first one. But even then, I mean, she's just telling Jesus that they're out of wine. Was she even expecting something miraculous? Was she expecting just to let him know? Okay, so, yeah. The interesting thing about this is that she tells him, first of all, how was Jesus born? It was a miracle. If anyone knew about the power of Jesus before anyone else, it would have been his mother. There was already something about Jesus that was different. So whether or not he had actually done a miracle before, and it says this is the beginning of the signs, based on what Mary had been told, Mary and Joseph had been told, she knew who Jesus was. She may not have known the full extent of what he was capable of, or even what his end goal was going to be on this earth. But she knew who Jesus was. She knew how he came about, so she knew that it was possible. Whether or not this was the reason that Mary told Jesus that they were out of wine, I think that there's some speculation. Based on what she says afterwards, though, you would think that she would think he could do something about it. But she says that he's out of wine. What does Jesus say to her? And you can read it for a quote if you want.
What does that have to do with me? Said, what does that have to do with me?
Yeah. He said, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, everything that I read, woman is not disrespectful in this. And so I've got this on the marker board at home so that anytime that I say woman to Janae, I can just say, it's not disrespectful. Jesus did it, and he was sinless. So obviously I think that there's, the way that this was translated, it wasn't in the same way, because anytime that I've heard woman in my life, it's not a very kind thing to say. But, and I always, even when I read this before, years ago, I always thought, man, that was kind of harsh, Mary tells Jesus that they're out of wine, and he says, woman? I just thought, that seems rough. But his point wasn't, and even the book, and when I say the book, it may have been a couple things I read, so I apologize, but that it was more of like a man instead of like a woman, like in a disrespectful way. And then the book even references or shows the other places in John in which Jesus says woman, and it's not disrespectful. Even, I think when he was on the cross, he says, "Woman, behold thy son." Obviously, that was not in some derogatory way towards his mother. He's saying, man, this is your son. Like, look upon this. So don't take that and, like anything, in the English language, use the translation to think, this was disrespectful. Yep.
Almost seems like those are bookends. I mean, her relationship has to change. He doesn't say mom.
Yeah.
He says woman. I'm not your son in the way that you have always thought of me. And then at the end of that, then definitely I'm not going to be here anymore. John, take care of her, and that's your son. So, I mean, there's a lot of significance to that. And, I think that her whole question or whole thought manifests some faith as well. But, I mean, just like the disciples who have accepted him as a Messiah to this point, they have no clue really what they're saying. They're going to have to grow into that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep.
Well, I was also thinking about the third day and tying it to that. And, actually everything started beginning for Christ, Jesus, with his baptism, John. And, John saw him coming, And then right after that, you start seeing this thing. He calls out Nathaniel and says, how do you know me? Well, I saw you under the fig tree. And so there's something different going on than what was before. I don't know what Christ's daily routine was before this began, but he's starting to collect disciples. Things are happening. So now there's something different going on. And I'm sure, I don't know, it doesn't specify in Scripture or anything like that, but you can see the Holy Spirit working here. There's something different going on, and it's obvious that it's not of men. Something's going on. So I'm thinking that's what Mary's seeing.
Yeah, it's certainly possible, whether it's that or her knowledge, but you don't see many men with disciples. The fact that Jesus had these men that had met them recently, that were following him based on his teaching, it was clear that, like James said, there was something different. So Mary says they're out of wine. Jesus says, well, what does this have to do with me? And then he says, my hour or mine hour has not yet come. What does this mean?
He knows when he starts his ministry, it's going to lead to his death.
Okay. In all the references in which Jesus talks about my hour, what is it referring to? Okay, in a general sense. His death, his crucifixion, the end of his life. So when he says, my hour has not yet come, and the book talks about this, whether or not Jesus was intending to begin his miraculous ministry here, it seems that it wasn't the time that he was going to do it based on his answer to his mother, but he does it, as we see anyway. I've always wondered why he said that and then did it. Was it out of respect for his mother? Was it out of kindness to her, to the wedding party? Or kind of why not? Let's just start it. I don't know. But either way, he says, my hour has not yet come, and he begins this. He knew that once this happened, his life was going to change significantly in the way that he was viewed by those that were around him. Miracles change people, and obviously for the good, but the chiefs, scribes, Pharisees, that's when their mission began. We have got to, this is something we've got to take care of and get rid of. Yeah.
So much can be said for patience and timing. Of course, we all think our kids are special, but if we knew that our child was special, he was 33 years old. I mean, he'd lived, an adult life and so on before all this started happening. And I know it's all the will of God and his timing, but we would be expecting to see things at 12, you know what I mean, or at 13, and when we did, but other things. I mean, it was just to me that he had lived a whole 32, 33 years before all this came about. To me was just God's timing and patience and so on from there.
Yeah, he, like you said, the miracles may not have happened, but he was definitely making an impact very young. When he was teaching in the temple, when his parents couldn't find him. Yeah.
To me, it kind of makes him relatable to us, because I think a common thought is determinism. And so people, I think it's a widespread belief that Jesus had everything planned out for him. And the cross was planned for him, but he was a man. And his life was no more planned day to day than ours was. And I think this kind of shows his humanity to the degree that he has a mission, he's very focused, and now he has an opportunity presented to him that he wasn't intending to, start his ministry with here, but that he made a decision out of his free will to do that. And I think that brings greater emphasis when we get to Jacob's well in John 4, that it wasn't just, okay, he's going through the motions because this was etched out before time began for him, but he sees opportunity and he seizes that. And so why he did it now, I don't know, but I think it manifests that he's making decisions, throughout his ministry to glorify God. It's not just mapped out for him entirely.
Yeah. It's a good point, DJ.
I also think it's, I was hearing my head earlier
Does anyone have anything else? Not necessarily, I'm moving on it. You know, one of the things that the book said, and I don't know why this would be, but it says that more than likely the wedding party was poor, and that's why they ran out of wine. That may be the case. I don't know. But either way, they ran out of wine. Mary noticed it, and I've kind of thought, you know, in the sense of how women can be at a party or at a, you know, wedding reception like this, kind of very aware of, you know, oh, we're out of plates, oh, we're out of paper towels, and all the guys are just like, you know, talking about whatever, and they're like, what? Now what? You know, they don't care about that. They want to go get their plate and fill it and, you know, eat, and then the women are always turning around and doing that. At least, I guess most of us probably can relate to that to some degree. But she noticed it was out of wine. They were out of wine. She told Jesus, and then she said, do whatever he tells you. So immediately after that, what does Jesus do?
Had to bring water and jugs.
He sees 6 water pots of stone, and it says, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Why do you think that how often does it talk about how many gallons certain vessels hold in the New Testament? Why do you think this was significant?
The quantity.
Yeah. It wasn't a cup. It wasn't, you know, what we have. It wasn't something to where you wonder whether or not, oh, was that actually wine in the bottom of that? This, you know, it says 20 or 30, so 6, it would have been between 120 to 180 gallons. That's a lot. I don't think it's a lot of liquid, whatever it is. So, he says to fill them with water. They filled them up to the brim, and he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it, and when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. Okay. So, he tells them to fill the water pots with water. They fill them with water. Jesus says, provide them to the master of the house, who, you know, and it kind of goes into this in the book of kind of like the coordinator, the wedding feast coordinator. And he tastes it, and he's blown away. This is so much better than the wine that they had originally been serving. So what does he do? He calls the bridegroom. I've always wondered, you know, and I know probably teaching a class and saying I've always wondered isn't something that, you know, maybe is a good thing. But maybe you've wondered it too. Why the master of the feast would go to the bridegroom and call him out on his wine selection is something that I've always wondered. However, I was talking to Brett about it last night, and I think the point wasn't in some disrespectful way that he was trying to approach the bridegroom, but he was curious as to why this wasn't used first. So he goes to the bridegroom and he says that, you know, usually you give the better wine at the beginning and then you give the more inferior wine, you know, towards the end. Without getting into, and the reason obviously is for sake of time, but in this context, what are we talking about? When it says wine, I know that the translation is oinos, but we're not talking about wine in the way that we think of it. And there's a lot of different reasons in this context that you can even show that that would be ridiculous. And the big one is because of how much Jesus would have made when they were already full. I remember, and I think it was Brett's lesson that he did on this, and he got it, I think, from a book written by a guy that talks about social drinking and different aspects of it. But he was talking about how, let's just say that you are talking about an alcoholic substance at this wedding party when Jesus made the water into wine. The fact that Jesus would have looked at the crowd, seen that they were completely drunk and satiated with alcohol, and he decides to make 180 gallons more, would mean that Jesus is the biggest alcohol promoter. There's no way that you could fight against any type of drinking or even drunkenness, because his first miracle is to do that. Now, obviously, when you get into the content, actually looking at the words that are translated here and what they mean, it doesn't necessarily mean all the time that it has to do with alcohol. And the book kind of goes into some of it. Another book, talks about oinos and how it's used in John chapter 2. It just means grape juice. Something from the wine or fruit juice of the grape. But even if it's, and this goes into that, fermentation in that time, the alcohol that it would yield compared to the way that it is done now and all of that. But did you have something?
No, you hit what I was going to say. It was a very watered down, I read, it's very watered down anyways.
Right. Even if it would have started the fermentation process, oftentimes it was used with water so that it wouldn't taste, a certain bitter way. But the alcohol content was so much less than even the lowest level that you could get now. Yeah.
Another thing we'll see about miracles is that it's not like getting better through medicine or surgery or whatever. It's a complete renewal. And so this is new. I mean, fermentation is a process of decay. This is new. It wouldn't make sense to perform a miracle and be imperfect because it's decaying. It's new and it's good in quality.
And I think that this is what at least the master of the house or the master of the feast was trying to point to. There was a difference between the wine that they had been drinking and what Jesus had created. I don't know how many of you like grape juice. I like grape juice. I really like cranberry juice, but I like grape juice. But I can tell the difference between fresh, like certain brands, and some knockoff convenience store stuff. If you gave me both, and I'm not saying that I'm a connoisseur, but I can tell the difference. And this is a silly example, but there is a difference between the quality of well-made grape juice compared to that of not. And I'm not saying this was squeezed by hand. There was something about this that was different. It was enough that the master of the house went to the bridegroom and asked him, "Why did you leave this out?" Now, who knew that this miracle had been created? DJ, did you have something? Sorry, I saw your hand.
Well, it's to your point. You have to be sober to be able to tell the difference. If you were well drunk, you could give somebody water and tell them it was alcohol and they wouldn't know the difference. I mean, you've seen videos
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So I've always thought it was a good point in there to if they were well drunk and he got something new, he was able to tell the difference. But if he was well intoxicated, he wouldn't have been able to tell it.
Yeah. Okay. For sure. I don't remember what I was saying before that. No, you're good.
Talk about cranberry juice.
Yeah, I said cranberry juice.
Who knew the miracle?
Yeah. Okay. So who knew the miracle at this time? The servants did. Now, more than likely, I can't imagine that it wasn't, even based on what Jesus said, "My hour hasn't come," that this would have spread. The servants aren't going to keep this to themselves. And whether or not they told the master, the bridegroom later, it doesn't say when they found out, when they may have found out. I can imagine that pretty soon after this, the bridegroom's like, "What are you talking about? I know how much wine we brought. You said there were 6 more jugs of good wine. I didn't know about it. Did you know about it?" And they start asking questions. They get to the servants and they're like, "That man said to fill it with water. He tasted it and it's wine." And, so the story goes, or may have went. So, this is his first miracle. And he knows that, it says in verse 11, "The beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." And then it says, after this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. and they did not stay there many days. So, the next story is another story that we know often or talk about, because we always talk about anger. And when the subject of anger or being angry comes up, what is often said by those in the church? Well, Jesus was angry, but he didn't sin. It's kind of a sometimes maybe misused, I think, a statement that Christians say to justify any anger that they have, whether it be right or wrong. Well, Jesus was angry. He drove men out of the temple. And they go to this story. Well, there's obviously, and I think that most of us are, adults here and understand that there's a difference between, the anger that Jesus had towards those that were defiling the temple and the anger that we sometimes have when, people cut us off in traffic or whatever. So Jesus comes into comes to Jerusalem. Verse 13, it says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who had sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing business. And when he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise.' And his disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house has eaten me up.'" So, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and he sees this at the temple. Why was this being done? Why were people selling doves and oxen and
Sacrifices.
yeah? Is that wrong? For people in the town to be selling things for people to be sacrificing? No. Why was he angry?
That's where it was.
And
They're taking advantage of it.
they were taking advantage of them. More than anything, I think that it wasn't because Jesus wasn't a proponent for economy and making sure, he wasn't on this mission to make sure that no one was being cheated. That wasn't wasn't something he would approve of, but that wasn't his goal. He wasn't in there trying to be fix the economy. It was where it was, and then on top of that, what was being done where it was. They were taking advantage of people, but they were doing it in the house of the Lord. And he drove them out. I've always wondered, I got to stop saying that. I really do got to stop saying that. But when he made this whip of cords, did he use it on the people, or did he just use it on the animals? I don't know. It was enough that I would assume that he probably used it on the animals. I can't imagine that he would beat the people. But either way, he made an impact, and he got them out. And one of the things that I had seen, and Jeremiah, you can maybe correct me on this or answer this, is that in one of the books that it said that this was the first of 2 times that Jesus had driven people out of the temple. And I thought, I don't remember the second time. Well, in Matthew chapter 21, and the reason that I've always thought that these were the same is because when you look at them side to side, the wording is very similar. But in Matthew chapter 21, it says there, and this is in verse 12, "Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, and you have made it a den of thieves.'" Are these 2 separate times? Do you think they are?
I believe they are. Mainly because the Gospel of John cites 3 Passovers, and we know that one of Matthew was in the Passover prior to his crucifixion.
That's what I had read, but I had never thought that those were 2 instances, and I may be the only one. But when I read, it says, "Drove out all those who bought and sold, overturned the table of the money changers, and sold doves." I know that there's a possibility they could be at both. But when I had read that, I had always just thought, it never dawned on me where this was in the book of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 21, in comparison, I always thought this was just another reference to that, or if it was just saying that this is what Jesus had done. I think that this is interesting, that we hear of Jesus doing this twice, trying to cleanse and purify the temple, and that people, when he would leave, would slowly make their way back in and start doing this again, because they knew that they could take advantage of the people coming in. Yeah.
And it kind of serves as a microcosm of the state of Israel. They're not changing. They're being given plenty of time, but they just keep going back to their old corrupt ways. Even when the Son of God has spent 3 years performing miracles and teaching, and they're hearing inside, and they're just going back to what they always were.
Yeah. DJ?
To your point earlier about people use this as an excuse to be angry because Jesus was angry, it doesn't really talk about the time that passed from when he saw it, when he had to go make the whip of cords and stuff like that, but it wasn't an immediate reaction. He went and made a whip of cords, so he had a lot of time to think about how he was going to handle the situation. So it wasn't like a knee-jerk reaction. He took time to think about it. It was a thoughtful process of how to handle the situation too.
Yeah. Yes, and then Murray.
I've always wondered, like you said,
Hey, there you go.
who authorized it? And if it was the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests, then this was the start of their anger towards him because he was messing with them.
Yeah. Yeah, their livelihood was being affected here, and they didn't care for that much. Yeah, Marie?
Well, I know that there's such a thing as righteous anger because we know God was angry. And Jesus said he was meek and gentle, and I know that meekness can mean gentle strength. But I have a little bit of, I didn't quite know how to put gentleness in this particular situation.
Right. Well, I don't think that someone that's gentle is always going to be gentle. I mean, you could be described as a gentle person, but that doesn't mean that 24/7 you're gentle. I don't think that, a parent who disciplines their child is being gentle at the moment they're doing it. Now, I think it's out of love that is shown, and I think that, in the long run, I don't think that any certain personality trait or characteristic means that is what they are 24/7, because I think even in this, when Jesus is showing this anger, it is done out of love. He is trying to show them that this is the house of the Lord that was provided to them to worship him, and it makes him angry. In the same way that a parent disciplines a child, it makes us angry because we want them to obey. We want them to do right. And I don't think that it necessarily means that he wasn't gentle. He may not have been gentle running out the sheaves or the oxen at that time. But yeah, Dara.
I think it's where we have to, be careful with biblical definitions versus our definitions today. Gentleness is a usefulness. And so when you're disciplining your child, it's what's useful, what's good for them in the moment. And that's the biblical gentleness, and I think that that's what you see there is I think, yes, he's absolutely always gentle, but it's useful, when you go take your child to get a shot or whatever because they're ill, it's what's needed, it's what's useful. And, I think that, that doesn't necessarily go along the same way, but
Yeah.
you're going to help them. And that's what Christ is always about, is helping people get to the right path. He
Yeah.
is not. And it taught so many, this is error, and
Yeah.
like DJ said, he was thoughtful in his process, and he was absolutely gentle as far as the Bible's concerned.
That's a good point. Yep.
Yeah, well, that was my whole point. There is such a thing as righteous anger. We can still be a gentle person.
Yeah.
Characteristic. Because, describing Jesus, it wouldn't have been any other way.
Right.
But anyway, it can come up, so.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it is rare. Most of us here know and understand the concept of meekness because we've studied it, we've talked about it. In the world, you usually have to kind of give some background on that word. You think of meek as weak. Those are the synonyms. Meek, weak, you're down, you're like a hurt puppy and you don't approach anyone. That's not what that means. And I think most of us know that, but sometimes you have to use these terms and kind of explain it. So, yeah.
Also, I think we need to think about effectiveness. Punishment fit the crime. So whenever, we discipline our children, they usually match up, And
That's a good
think
point.
If Jesus had walked through there and said, what are y'all doing?
Yeah.
You need to stop. I don't think that would have been effective in this situation.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that it's, because we know that Jesus was perfect, we know that his actions in these situations was right and righteous. Otherwise, if there was any question, we'd say, well, Jesus did no sin. He wasn't wrong. And I think his ability to be able to look at the situation and know exactly what was needed at that time and do it was how we know how serious it was. This was a big deal. And of all the things that happened to Jesus, this is man's perspective, this is human's perspective. Of all the things that happened, this wouldn't have been the one that I would have thought he would have been the most angry about. And I think that is why, or it's very telling to show the difference between fleshly and spiritual mindset. Because things were done to him that I would think, okay, that deserves righteous indignation. That deserves to be angry. But what made him angry was the defilement of the temple. And he wanted to completely, get rid of it. Yeah.
Similar point. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul talks about people that are struggling and gives degrees, whether they're weak, whether they're discouraged, or whether they're unruly. And the response is different for each of those people, whether we're helping them, encouraging them, or warning them. The idea of jerking them out of the fire is the idea that's painted. The sanctity of the temple, the efficacy of their worship was at stake there. I equate it to Paul, motivated by preserving the truth of the gospel, withstanding Peter to his face in the presence of all. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anger, but it makes it very clear, hey, this is serious.
Yeah.
And there's serious consequences to not stopping this from continuing.
Yeah, and anybody that came into the temple would have been approached by this and seen this, and it would have affected their ability to worship God in the way that he had told them to worship him. So it obviously was something that made him angry. So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us since you do these things?" And what does Jesus say? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And what did the Jews say? They fully understood exactly what he's talking about, right? What did they say? Yeah. 3 days. It took 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to destroy it and raise it up in 3 days. And then I think it's interesting that John even tells us exactly what he was referring to. Before you even have that, because of the 3 days, I think that many, based on the other Gospels, if you'd read the other Gospels, you may have an inkling of what Jesus was talking about here. But he even says that if there's any question, he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the Scripture and the word which Jesus had said. I think it's interesting that in John chapter 2, it references Jesus' resurrection and also the disciples' remembrance of things that he had told them this far back. I've wondered... I gotta stop. I gotta think of something else to say instead. But I've thought about this before. When the disciples, after Jesus had died, how much did they were able to go back and think about, those things? And obviously, the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 2, revealed a lot of things to them. But at the moment of Jesus' death, being able to recall, or his death and even his resurrection especially, to recall these things, I can imagine there were so many light bulb moments that they were like, that's what he meant. Okay, now I see it. And this is a perfect example. They didn't understand then. It says that they remembered this when he was raised from the dead. Oh, when Jesus was... And like humans, because, again, said this before, the apostles, disciples, they were humans, saying to each other, do you remember when we were in the temple and Jesus drove them out and he said, destroy it in 3 days and I'll raise it again? He was talking about this. And they're like, yeah, I remember that. I bet that there were a lot of those. I may be wrong, but it says that they recalled these things that Jesus had taught them, a lot of things they didn't understand. But that's what I'll close with. So appreciate your participation in John chapter 3 next Wednesday.